This webinar is one of the many tools available online from CBRN to support Canadian businesses and to foster recovery. Webinars like this are made possible thanks to our many partners, including Desjardins. Today's webinar, entitled Brave New World, Navigating the Crisis and Its Aftermath, will explore where our economy stands and where it is moving towards. Our speaker today is Jimmy Jean, a macro strategist with Desjardins Capital Markets. Jimmy is a CFA, an economist, and has held senior roles with Caisse de dépôt, Moody's, and Statistics Canada. Jimmy, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. We are all interested in your forward-looking economic analysis and observations on the type of innovative thinking required for Canada to foster economic recovery. While Jimmy is presenting his findings, I encourage those watching today to submit their questions through the Slido link sent to you through your registration email earlier today. We'll get to your questions right after Jimmy finishes his presentation. And again, I encourage everyone to mute their lines at this time. And Jimmy, I now turn things over to you for your presentation that you have prepared for us. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Patrick. First of all, do you hear me well? Can everybody hear me? Thank you.
Thank you.
We always have to make this sure. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. Pretty glad to be here and to be having that conversation with everyone today. I will be giving you a perspective of course, the economic outlook and some of the challenges we're currently facing, where we are in this sort of this recovery, this attempt at a recovery, and also some of our thinking in terms of the next expansion cycle, the next recovery, and what shape this is likely to take, and how different it might be from the last expansion cycle, the one we've just recently ended. So let me go ahead and just share my screen here. Okay, so here's a snapshot of our Canadian economic outlook and numbers. So typically, those presentations we start by giving these numbers for the economy and for a number of financial market statistics. So that's our best guess. What we have as a forecast for the Canadian economy is a 40% contraction for the second quarter. We'll get that data officially by StatsCan. That's data. And then for the third quarter, what we have is a 42% rebound August down as a result of the reopening decisions. Now, we already have some data for the second quarter, preliminary data that suggests that we're pretty on track for that minus 40% estimate. But of course, clarity diminishes quite a bit when we look further, and especially as it relates to the size of the expected rebound in the third quarter. So that 42% might look impressive at face value, but that's just if you focus on the growth number per se. But it really starts from such a depressed level of GDP that even with that kind of rebound, it would still leave us 6% below the level of 2019. And indeed, the numbers that we have in our outlook are not consistent with a return to that level of outputs until the middle of 2022. So a full 2 years from now. So what that means is that interest rates will be kept at their current lower bound for many years to come. The markets now are positioned for at least 3 years without interest rate hikes in both Canada and the US, and we tend to agree with that assessment. It also means that we, unfortunately, will have to tolerate very high deficits, very high levels of deficits, in order to prevent an even worse economic outcome. So in essence, we're left with not much of an alternative here, and these deficits might turn out to be what prevents this severe recession from becoming a depression. Now, the point we keep making over and over about the outlook is that, of course, the uncertainty is unprecedented. You had the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve that did not produce any outlooks through last spring. because of that reason. So in essence, the range of outcomes, the confidence interval, if you will, around any given statistic these days is just extremely wide. And we've seen surprises on the upside, surprises on the downside. So dealing with the kind of numbers we're currently talking about is something that the forecasting community is, let's be honest, not well equipped for. It's the first time we worked through a pandemic. That's the first thing. The second thing is that just on managing the virus itself, it is a process of trial and error, and we have evidence of that already. So we're economists, not epidemiologists, and even if we were, I'm not sure we'd have that much more clarity. And then thirdly, I think it's important to mention that it's an environment that's particularly fertile for policy mistakes. So those policy mistakes could take the form, for example, mistake too early, letting the infection rate creep higher, and that forces a slowdown in the reopening, or even worse yet, a rollback of reopening decisions. And then you have the potential for fiscal policy mistakes, so letting support measures expire too soon, or, for example, rolling out programs that are not really all that effective because of the way they're designed. So all these risks are part of the environment. So those necessary caveats having been made, what I'm nonetheless going to do today is give you an overview of what the current data is telling us as to where we stand, and then maybe touch on a couple of issues, like I mentioned, that will be important to, or that will be part of the environment even long past this pandemic, in our view. So here you have some numbers, some statistics on the reopening. So to track the recovery, of course, we have the standard data that we usually look at, the retail sales, the jobs report, GDP, etc. But the shortcoming of this data is that it takes time before we get it. And that's particularly in the case in Canada. It can take 7-8 weeks after the reference month before we get the statistics. So what we like to do is look at indicators that are more timely, that are higher in frequency, and that give us a sense of how that reopening process is going. And here what you see is the data from the Google Mobility Report. It's been pretty useful. It's a daily index of how people are on the move relative to prior to the pandemic, and that's what you see on this chart. Now we know that consumer spending is about 2/3 of the economy, so we're particularly interested in the retail and recreation sub-index as a proxy for how people re-engage in live consumer spending activity. And what this shows you is that in the case of Canada, across provinces, that's the left chart, we're not quite close to being back to normal, but we're no longer in that dead zone we were in March and April. We're kind of somewhere in between across provinces. Now, if you were to compare how we've been doing in Canada relative to the states, that especially the states that are currently struggling in the US, you see that on the right chart, and you see that the lockdowns were less stringent in some of these states. For example, Texas in the light blue. You see that the trough of that series is a bit higher than it's been in Canada, which is the black line here. And you see that they were quicker to start to reopen. And with the result that right now they're coping with a very acute flare-up of the pandemic, and they have to roll back those reopening decisions. You can see the curve for Texas, for Arizona, the orange line, the green line for Florida. Those curves are rolling over. So the big question is, with what we're seeing in the U.S., is it a risk in Canada as we are reopening, especially in provinces that were initially less affected? Is that a risk that we suffer the same fate? If it is a risk, the answer to that is a definite yes. But it's probably not just the fact that you are reopening that matters. It's also what sort of safeguards and rules you have around these reopenings, and very importantly, how compliant population and businesses are to those requirements and recommendations. And certainly the Google mobility data is pretty useful, but it doesn't capture all those variables that also matter. So the answer is that it is a risk, but it's not necessarily the case. I mean, reopening is you can see it as a necessary condition to create a flare-up, but it's not a sufficient condition. We know there are a number of other mitigation factors, for example, social distancing, masks, and so on and so forth. But it's certainly something, a big reminder that nobody's complacency shouldn't be let taking place, and nobody's immune to that kind of risk. Now, looking at what's happening in terms of confidence, the good news is that we're seeing a bit of a recovery. This is on the left chart. You have the small business sentiment index from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the green line, and you can see that compares to the 2019 average, and you can see that we're back at pretty close to this average. It's pretty impressive, the recovery we've seen. I think it's been alongside those reopening decisions that have at least brought a bit more clarity to businesses. Now, what you see on the gray line is the consumer confidence index from the Conference Board of Canada, and this one is a little bit weaker, and it's, we can understand why. I mean, you're talking about an employment rate that's at 14% as of May. 14%, that's just a conventional measure of the unemployment rate, but when you broaden the definition to fully capture the extent to which people are underutilized, maybe working less hours than they normally would, you get to a figure to actually 35%. So that's huge. So there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, and consumers are still cautious in re-engaging and also in terms of their intentions to spend on big ticket items, for example. So it's kind of a mixed picture. On the business side, it's it's recovering. You see on the right chart here, the capacity utilization. You have more businesses saying that they're operating at 70% or above now, relative to the case back in April, when you only had you had a majority of businesses saying that they were operating at 30% or below. So that's already a good sign of improvement. But we know that there's still a lot of wood to chop here, and it's going to depend on how fast the reopening proceeds and whether it produces a flare up or not. Now, when it comes to the job market, well, we're going to get some new numbers on Friday. So far, from February to May, we've seen declines across provinces of around between 10 and 15%. So that gives a rough sense of the reduction in employment. You also have statistics on hours that show an even steeper decline, around 27% decline in aggregate hours worked. We have unemployment rates in double-digit territory across provinces. So that's something that we know is going to improve. We already had a pretty good number for the month of May. And we do expect to see a pretty solid number. So the number we are going to get on Friday, we expect to see 750,000 jobs created. But even with that, that would still leave us 2 million jobs behind, below the level of February. And very importantly, it's pretty clear that there's going to be a wedge between the outcomes of the temporary unemployed and the permanently unemployed. So in April, for example, 97% of the job losses were categorized as temporary, but then you had the crisis dragging on. I mean, initially people thought that it would be a 2-week lockdown or something like that, but then we know what happened. So more and more of those initially temporarily unemployed became effectively permanently unemployed, and that's really what as forecasters, economists, what really is on top of our minds is what level of residual unemployment will we be left with. So those numbers that we're currently seeing, we know that they're going to come down, but there are some sectors that we know will not be able to operate normally, and here we kind of look at this. We've identified a number of sectors that we think are the most at risk of remaining unable to operate normally for the medium term. And generally, these comprise the services that cannot operate without contact and gatherings. So the public transportation, for example, airlines, dine-in restaurants, bars, nightclubs. Not that they're not reopening in some ways, but they're much more restricted compared to some of the other sectors. And by our estimate, these sectors account for about 15% of employment across provinces and 10% of GDP. So that gives a rough sense of the reduction in potential economic activity until the day that we managed to reach full eradication, for example, with a vaccine. So it's not to mean that you have 10% of the economy that doesn't run at all, but it's that 10% experiences what's more likely to be an L-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery. So not able to come back nearly as quickly to normal levels of activity as the other sectors. But the good news from that is that you have 90% of the economy that's either recovering rapidly or that wasn't even affected to start with. And that is certainly the case for most knowledge industries. So that takes me to one of the big, I think, one of the big themes and one of the outcomes that is likely to endure. And it's this sudden emergence of mass telework. So telework is interesting because I think it's received some attention, but not as much as I think it should, at least in economic circles. But if there's a thing that may come out as a legacy of this crisis, I think it could be this, and it could have very profound implications for not just for Canada, but for all developed economies. So for example, StatsCan said that you had 4.7 million people not usually teleworking that now are teleworking. So that's 39% of all workers. And what's emerged as pretty clear in various surveys of employee satisfaction, for example, is that a majority of the people do appreciate the experience. It does not seem to have had a major detrimental impact on productivity. You see that on the right chart here. So most employees say that things are okay or great. So there's only a number of them, a minority, think that this is awful. And when people get asked how they envision work life post-pandemic, you have only a minority who see a full return to the office the way it was before. That's about 36% of respondents surveyed in an Angus Reid poll. So those numbers come from a recent poll by Angus Reid. So the majority of Canadians think there will be essentially a hybrid arrangement of part office, part home work schedules. Now, we all know the drawbacks of remote working, managing kids. Trust me, I know. The lack of spontaneous interaction and nonverbal communication, those things, and that's why most people think it has to be some hybrid. And only minority think that it should be made like 100% all the time. But I think even part-time telework is going to be the norm for a number of other reasons. Well, first of all, economic. The pandemic and the cost savings has had many companies thinking about how the the impact of all this, and whether it really makes sense to return back to the way it was before. There was an interesting interview this morning with the Deutsche Bank CEO. He said on that subject, he said the cost savings were material, and that internally they had come to realize how much they were traveling for strictly internal reasons. And it's certainly something that many, if not all, medium and large organizations can relate to. And in terms of the efficiency gains from that change in work lifestyle, if you will, it's pretty significant. Like I mentioned, employee satisfaction seems to be good, and very importantly, it's the social benefits from this kind of shift. So at a public policy level, telework aligns extremely well with global warming reduction objectives. You have 5 million people not taking their cars, not putting strains on commuting-related infrastructure. So that frees up public funds that can be redirected to things like healthcare, like education. So essentially what we're talking about is that we have a technology available that's able to hit so many birds with one stone. So it's hard to see how pursuing this new way of work would not be actually actively encouraged by governments going forward. So that's what I think is going to happen in this next cycle. And it's something that could be very close to be a little revolution here. Effectively, it's I compare this to as if we had invented teleportation for about 40% of our labor force. Now, the thing with this is that we're talking about a very disruptive shift. And anytime you're talking about a disruptive shift that's technologically based, you have those that are on the losing end. And you see the chart here, it shows telework capacity in Canada. And you can see how obviously it's very concentrated. It's very high in knowledge-based industries, finance, insurance, education, professional services, tech, and very low in transportation, manufacturing. You can't build a house remotely. It's very hard to do. So it creates problems. It's not a free lunch. It's far from a free lunch, because then you get to think about those that are on the losing end. So the transportation industry is, for example, cabs, public transportation, airlines, commercial real estate, because now you're likely to be dealing with an oversupply of office real estate. You have all sorts of sectors of activity that depend on people commuting and being at the office. So all the downtown area, restaurants, coffee shops. We had Starbucks announcing it would close 600 locations across North America. The whole event industry, conventions, and where that creates issues or exacerbates issues, should I say, is that these are all sectors that we know tend to hire people with more basic education levels, maybe students, a high proportion of recent immigrants, people that are generally at the lower end of the income scale. So this is where the story about telework actually touches another even broader theme, which is going to be critical for this recovery, and that's the theme of inequalities. So inequality, the IMF has found that past pandemics have reduced employment for people with only basic levels of education by 5% on average over a 5-year period. So it will not be different this time around. We've already seen in the stats, for example, the unemployment rate for people with a high school degree or less is about double the overall unemployment rate. And telework is just a consequence of the pandemic, but that will come to exacerbate those inequalities and as a matter of fact, lead them to persist over time. Now, the other thing that touches on inequality is that right now we're having a very tough, very difficult conversation about racism. And, it started with what happened, of course, in the United States, but it quickly got into the things that were being debated in recent years quite actively, and the sort of the more insidious, covered, subconscious type of discrimination. Now, what this chart shows here, this is a result of a McKinsey study that showed that the level of economic activity, that's for the United States, but the level of economic activity that could be generated by closing racial disparities in the US, economic disparities. We're talking about a potential 1 to 1.5 trillion worth of GDP in the next 8 years. It's not small change. We're talking about basically 7% of GDP that could be basically unlocked by addressing those issues. Well, we ourselves as a welcoming country with a very high integration rate of immigrants into the labor force. That's certainly true, but it doesn't mean that the problems don't exist. What was interesting, it was a study by the University of Toronto that showed that job applicants from diversity backgrounds had a significantly higher probability of being called on in interviews if they made their resumes quote unquote wider. And for example, that's either if they tweak their first names or their experience. For instance, saying that you're a tennis player gets you more hits than saying you're a basketball player. Those were examples. And they found a 3 callback for those that had modified their resumes as such. So it's just an example that, we still have work to do. We still have work cut out to do for us on that front, and that there are economic gains in doing so. So this is perhaps a lesson for the next cycle. Just paying lip service won't do enough, because in that same University of Toronto study, what they also found is that the bias there was no difference in bias whether companies explicitly said that they were equal opportunity employers or not. So it is something that I think is going to be part of the conversation, but it's I think a very big positive if we manage to make economic growth more inclusive. And I'm going to talk just a little bit later about why this is so important, because the old recipes, the whole strategies are not going to work. So here, what you see here, two charts on climate change, because this is another intractable issue. The world is on track to warm by 4 degrees by the end of the century. And one model that is emerging from the economics field as a leading tool is that model is suggesting right now that letting the planet warm by 4 degrees would cost $30 trillion US. So that's 1.5 times the size of the US economy today. You see in these charts how global warming is causing increasing costs globally here in Canada. So it's of course a topic we could spend another hour on. We don't have that time, but I think overall, and this brings me to just the takeaways from those introductory remarks. Well, first of all, the pandemic is causing more, not less, inequality. The response to the pandemic, it only works in the way of exacerbating that inequality. When you leave that unchecked, it has all sorts of effects on society, increasing dissatisfaction, polarization, favoring populism. And that only works to make the economic environment less predictable, with the attendant effect on business investment, innovation, even scientific research that is being attacked. What we've seen happening at a social level, at a political level, has in many ways been, has found its root in inequality. So I think the last cycle has a lot of lessons for getting a number of problems fixed for the next expansion cycle. And the other thing is that, pandemic or not, the planet is warming. And if we leave that unchecked as well, then the costs are going to be even larger than from the pandemic itself. So I think the crisis gives us a really huge opportunity to raise these issues to the top of the priority list, and by the same token, move away from our excessive dependence on monetary policy. And I think monetary policy is effectively at its limits. Canadian households are deeply indebted, and any solution that relies on more consumer leverage is inherently unsustainable. So this is how I think the solutions are going to have to be novel, and they're going to have to focus on sustainable and inclusive growth. It's the good news is that those issues are known. It's just that now we're at the crossroads where it's time to take action. So I still have a lot of hope that, and you can see, never let a good crisis go to waste. That's an interesting quote, but this gives us a big opportunity to adjust how the trajectory this society was engaged in, and make for more sustainable growth going forward. So on this note, I'll be ready to take some questions if there are any.
Thank you, Jimmy, for the presentation. I learned a lot. Now, I'd like to remind everyone, please submit your questions to Jimmy for consideration via the Slido link that was sent through the registration. To give you some time to do that, I'll ask some questions myself. So, it looks like we have 2 questions here on Slido already queued up. Jimmy, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Perfect. So, I mean, I think you covered quite a bit of this, but if you want to sort of really emphasize, how will this economic recovery look different than the last recession? It seems, the Great Recession.
Yes, I think it's going to be a recovery that is going to be, there's no more blank checks. I think it's pretty clear. We've learned the lessons of using monetary policy extensively. It's the easy way, but we understand better than we did 12 years ago the ramifications, how it boosts, for example, the housing market gets people more in debt, more financially strained, and not able to absorb the kind of shocks we just went into. So the reason why the government had to be so generous was, in part because Canadian households, and the same thing in the U.S., but the average Canadian household was not in a good position to really absorb this kind of shock. So you do nothing, and you have a massive wave of bankruptcies and defaults right there. So it just shows you how unsustainable that model of business is. The last few years, there's been a growing awareness as to global warming, its impact. We've lived through certain impacts from certain natural catastrophes. These are only likely to keep continuing going forward. So it's raised that idea that as in Canada in particular, we need to transition away from these models and adopt approaches that might not lead the biggest economic GDP growth figures that we've seen. We're not talking 4 or 5%, but if we're talking 1% or 1.5%, but 1.5% that's sustainable, that's already an achievement. And we at Desjardins actually have done some research to show that the statistics that we look at in terms of to determine our success in fostering economic activity, GDP, how imperfect that measure is, and going forward, it's not going to be just about gross GDP growth, but it's going to be GDP growth, but also and also how sustainable that growth is. That's going to be part of the conversation increasingly, and it's not going to be only done by the governments, but I think also by corporations and consumers will increasingly demand that. So I think there are many ways that we can be optimistic that this change will accelerate going forward. Great,
thank you. And another question here. what economic indicators or trends will you be following very closely over the next couple of months?
So I'm looking at in terms of how much of economic, how much of employment we actually recover. That's something I'm looking at. I'm not necessarily looking so much at the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate is, in my view, a skewed statistic. It doesn't give there are many moving parts, and in the current state of pandemic, it doesn't do full justice. That's why I talked about underutilization, which is at 35%. That's the kind of statistic I'll be paying close attention to. But one of the things I think is going to be crucial, vital, is bankruptcies. Right now, so far, we haven't seen. If anything, we've seen a decline in bankruptcies on a year-over-year basis. It's quite impressive, but it shows you the impact of the income supporting measures that have been rolled out by the federal government. Now, we know that these measures are not eternal. At one point, they will be phased out. In what conditions and what businesses and and who, in terms of consumers and households, will sort of fall off the cliff, and what kind of spike in bankruptcies will we see? That's a big open question. So in many ways, we've absorbed the shock. We've only kicked the can down the road. This is something that's, I think, is going to be crucial, particularly in the second half, in the fourth quarter, first quarter of 2021. That's when we're likely to see some problems there.
And just in follow up to this, you mentioned that remote work could also be a big dynamic shift in the market. What are some key indicators tied to remote work that would indicate sort of the foundations have changed?
Well, I think it's in terms of remote work. We have data from Statistics Canada that and they've been pretty quick in turning around and changing their methodology methods and their methods and gather that information on the extent of telework and the number of hours working remotely versus in the office. They already had started that process prior to the pandemic, so that came in to be very useful. I think they will have they will have a significant number of insights to provide on this topic. But I think what's going to be interesting as well is how Canada compares to the rest of the world, because the story of telework is there's a cultural dimension to that as well. So even prior to the pandemic, we know that telework was more accepted in Europe, especially in Scandinavian countries, than it was, for example, in the United States or even here in Canada. How is that going to change, and whether we'll see with that big laboratory or that big experiment, will we see better acceptance of telework? This is going to be something that's going to be very interesting. But like I said, it's not a free lunch, and I think how the social and the economic fabric of downtown areas, in particular across North America, that's going to be something also that could prove very disruptive.
Great, thank you. Next question here says, what economic impacts, if any, do you see the ending in August of the wage subsidy? So I think I think they're asking what will happen if the wage subsidy ends in August.
Well, I think it's something that you'll have some positive, but you'll have some negative. It's going to depend, I think, on how they end this. If you end this cold turkey, it's probably not the best solution, because you have people that are still going to be in need of this kind of support. People that are tied to sectors that really we can't expect to recover very rapidly. The entertainment sectors, the airlines, people working for airlines. It's going to be tough for the long haul. But it's a question we get often, because I think and anecdotes have been quite numerous, especially in sectors that hire a lot of part-time workers at the minimum wage. We did the exercise of pulling out the average wage rates from Statistics Canada from a range of occupations, trying to focus on the type of occupation that cannot be performed remotely, of course. But we've been trying to get a sense of the level of wage replacement that CERB offers. So in other words, what percentage of your income did CERB replace? And we found that to be highest for cashiers, for bartenders, for hotel hosts, for barbers and hairstylists. So the wage replacement rate was between 150% and 200% in those cases for part-time workers. So what this means is that the cashiers make nearly double the income they make on CERB than at work. So yes, it acts as an impediment to ramping things back up. For full-time workers, it's less clear. You only have cashiers and barbers for this, where this is a problem. But it's pretty clear that some kind of phase out and reduction in eligibility will need to be introduced. They've tried, in deciding in that last extension, they've tried to introduce some form of phase out. It didn't go through it was blocked by the NDP. But I think, the last extension alone was $30 billion. Our starting point in terms of deficit was around that 30 billion. 30 billion is huge. So it's really costly for 2 months, 30 billion. Increasingly, it's going to be hard to sustain those programs. So I think that what they've effectively done is punt that issue down the road, but sooner or later, this will need to, because it is a very big disincentive to work, and it limits the extent of recovery that we would have seen if that factor wasn't in place. Just to give a last example, the Quebec government increased premiums for people working in the health sector. In the heart of the pandemic, there was a very acute need for aides in long-term care centers, and Premier Legault was very critical that CERB acted in a way of them being able to get people in the system, and they had to effectively increase wages. Now, not all businesses have the luxury of being able to increase wages. So, yeah.
And as businesses have begun to hire back, have you seen any signs of the approximation of the percentage of their workforce they've been able to bring back on?
We're going to get that on Friday, so that's going to be very interesting, because on the last report that was a report of May. As of this report, we still have a good 10%. We're still 2 million below the level we were at in terms of employment. So we've recovered, in that report, we've recovered around 400,000, but we still have 2 million to go. We expect, we have 2.7 million to go, 2.7 million to go. We expect 750,000 jobs created in June. So that would leave us 2 million to go from this point on. The thing is, I think, May and June are basically months where you start the engine back. So that creates a big rush of people coming back to work. When you get into July and August, and that effect wears off, that's where it was going to be really interesting to see, what kind of job creation numbers we get at that point. when most of the people that were kind of laid off on a temporary basis are pulled back in? What's the residual? And you have a number of conflicting forces. For example, we have business bankruptcies that are likely to continue over that period. So you could have people that are rehired, but that will eventually lose their jobs. There's a lot of moving parts here. But I think when we're more in, couple of months after the official reopening, a good 3 months, August, September, I think we'll have a better sense of how this is going.
And throughout this challenging, we have a few more questions here. Oh, good. Okay, so regarding the McKinsey study on GDP, can you comment on what impact would more equality practices have on Canada's GDP? Or is this purely U.S.?
Yeah, I think this is the study was conducted for the U.S. So I wouldn't venture into a number. I think it gives us a sense that tackling these issues has some economic benefit. Having said that, I think to the extent that some of these other studies have found that those problems, those issues of discrimination exist as well in Canada. I think it's pretty clear that there would be a major advantage in tackling them, and one of the ways increasing diversity and inclusion. One of the ways this has been shown at a very micro level is that it brings a range of different perspectives, new ways or new methods of thinking about certain problems, new problem solving approaches, innovation. So some studies have shown, generally across the globe, that you have those kind of benefits. And we know that in Canada, we've been suffering from an innovation deficit and a productivity deficit against the United States. So these are, again, I was talking about hitting a few birds with the same stone. This is an example of how we could extract many benefits from taking an even more forceful approach, a more ambitious approach in that direction. I mean, Canada is not the one that's doing the worst on this front, but it doesn't mean that we can't do better.
Thank you. And do you see more businesses moving towards online sales platform versus storefronts in the future?
Yeah, this is clearly another. This was a well-established trend, to be sure. I mean, the emergence of Amazon. It's not a story from yesterday. It's been a while, and Amazon's domination, or the domination of online retail, was well-established trend. But the pandemic has the result of exacerbating this. I mean, a lot of people. Just an anecdote. I met with one old acquaintance last weekend, and he was telling me that he was kind of old school, not too fond of buying online, but the pandemic had forced that adjustment, and now he's sold. Now he will only buy things online. So it has that effect of bringing the awareness, the efficiency of online buying to some people. So certainly it's something that was well established, that is there to stay. And going into this, it was already understood that commercial space would have to be oriented towards more the experience type of offerings. For example, restaurants, shows, things of that nature, rather than the physical buying of things. If anything, that trend, to me, it looks likely to be exacerbated, and that's why I tend to be worried about how how our downtown cores will look, how the commercial real estate market will look because there are very profound shifts all occurring at the same time.
Here's another question: How are rural versus urban communities faring during this time comparatively? What are some of the different challenges that they have in regards to recovery?
I think it's interesting because the pandemic itself has often been associated with an urban phenomenon, or at least has been more, up until recently, it's been more associated with the large urban centers. The New York of this world, in Canada, Montreal was the region that was most affected. And it was thought that the density in cities was, favored more a higher infection rate. And then we saw this move to southern U.S. states that are perhaps a little bit less dense. So it just shows that nobody's fully immune. But some of the dynamics that it's still anecdotal, but we're increasingly hearing about how this is when it comes to the housing market, how telework is giving the incentive to many people to work to move to more remote areas, with lower cost of living, for example. So here in Quebec, it's something that we've seen many stories about, how housing markets in very remote areas are currently seeing multiple offers, something that they're certainly not accustomed to. And just as a function of people from Montreal moving to these areas now that they can work from home permanently and indefinitely. So you might see that in a very near term. I think 5-10 years down the road, when this is hopefully behind, I think the trend is still going to be towards urbanization, given the presence of universities, being innovation hubs and tech hubs and so on and so forth. I think it's still going to be a world of where most of the population of a developed country is concentrated in urban settings.
Now, things like adapting to these challenging times, whether going online or having to put, if you're a storefront business or storefront restaurant and you're having to put out a patio outside, all these things cost money to do right now. What sort of appetite are you and capacity do you see businesses having for borrowing, accessing credit, and seeking credit at this time?
It's been quite, it's been mixed, right? And especially with some of the programs that were put in place, for example, the Canadian Commercial Rent Assistance Program, the take-up was underwhelming. Even some of the programs that focus on providing businesses with loans, sort of bridge loans to get through. For example, the $40,000 measure, Canadian, I think it was the business account. The take-up was not what many people thought it would be, because, and this is something we kept saying, especially in April, as those programs were getting rolled out, they focused a lot on more debt, and for many businesses, just the lack of clarity about how long this would last, and maybe where maybe small business owners were in the life cycle. For example, somebody aged in their 60s owning a business, are they really interested in taking up that kind of debt to get through when they're only so close to retirement? There's a bunch of complications that have probably come in the way of those programs, and I think the answer is different. It depends on the sector you're in. and the conditions and the competitive nature of the sector. I mean, if you're in a niche environment and for example in tech, and you have the prospects are pretty good going forward, then it might make sense. But in some other sectors, it clearly does not make sense. Now, to be sure, some sectors were kind of more in some traditional, and this goes back to the rural versus urban areas. Some sectors in very rural areas that were kind of in very traditional, for example, whatever remains of textile industry in Canada. Those some companies that probably checked out would have done so in the next 3 years anyways. So you have some of that, but I think it's really it has to do with the nature of operations, and certainly if you had programs that relied more on grants, probably you would have seen better, more interest. So, but this is a choice the government has made. We have to understand that these programs are extremely costly. There's that consideration too. I mean, Canada just lost its AAA status with one of the credit rating agencies. It just shows the deficit and debt burden from all these programs. So we can understand why they're trying to sort of manage that aspect as well. But it certainly has some effects. And when we talk about this topic, we talk about the very essence of economic capacity. So if those programs, as I mentioned, are not well designed or don't generate enough interest, and business owners prefer to go out of business, then the big recovery we're hoping to see, the V-shaped recovery we're hoping to see in terms of employment, in terms of GDP, that just won't happen because the capacity is no longer there. So and this is a big intangible. We don't have a firm read as to how much capacity we've lost at this point.
I think I hear some children in the background. I don't know if it's from you or someone else on the line, but given the important connection between childcare, schooling, and workforce participation, any thoughts on sort of whether or not those issues will be sorted out by the fall, and just the importance of the two, the interrelation between the two.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's that's a great point in terms of this recovery and what could come in the way of this recovery, and it's this. The nature of things have made that child we've had to keep children at home. So when people get called back, and especially it turns out to be women that still to this day handle the core of childbearing responsibilities in the typical household. The restrictions that have continued to be put in place, either school closures or daycare being closed, or social distancing measures in various daycare facilities, that is also a factor that it's been an impediment to some women in particular being able to get back to work as they're getting called back. Now, so that's why it's important that the pandemic is under control, such that by the fall we can have better confidence in our ability to maybe lessen those restrictions a bit to the extent that it's possible, or that it's sensible to do so, in order to increase the capacity in schools and in the childcare system, and allow more people to be able to get back to work. But this has been also part of the mix, and for the time being, a factor restricting the pickup in employment. It's one of the many complications of this pandemic, indeed.
Great. I think this will be our last question before wrapping up. But what's one thing that we haven't been speaking enough about during this economic recovery, and those considering what to do?
I think that's a good question, because we've talked about we've talked about many things, but in my view, like I mentioned, the impact on just on inequality and fairness. I mean, we've talked about this at length because of what happened, right? I think my concern or my fear is not that we're not talking about it enough. Is that ultimately at some point it starts to wear down, and that the resolve to address those issues starts to wane over time. That's kind of the natural instinct, right? Whereas those issues require long-term commitment and especially actions. So I would put it this way. Yeah, I'm not that I think that this particular issue is not to the forefront, but it has to stay. And I think if anything, in Canada we have I think you look at the leadership level and of corporations and how they've been pretty passionately engaged in this. I have hope that we'll see some concrete actions, and that those new principles will be a driving force behind decisions. And that we can talk about corporations as well. The investor community has also a major role to play, and there always were some approaches, for example, ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance principle. Why don't we add a D to that? Diversity. Those are all ideas that I think could be set forth and create a better environment, or an environment or society that's more aligned to everybody's, I think, ideals. But the focus has to be kept.
Great. Well, I'm sorry, everyone. We've come to the end of our hour and we have to conclude, but I want to thank you again for joining us today. And I want to thank Jimmy for taking the time to share his insights and his analysis with us. This session has been recorded and will be posted on CBRN, our website, in the next couple of days. And everyone who joined us today will receive a link to this video once it's ready. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful and productive day with what's remaining. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks,
Thank you
Jimmy.
very much.